My name is Margaret, and I'm 72 years old. I never thought my own grandson would laugh at me for something as simple as my handwriting. My hands have never been graceful. They used to be steady once when I was younger, when I taught at the local elementary school. I used to write on chalkboards with such precision that my students would comment on how perfect every A and E looked. Back then, my handwriting was something I was proud of. It was my small art form. But time, as it does, had other plans. Years of arthritis had turned that once graceful penmanship into something shaky, something uneven. I knew it wasn't pretty anymore, but I never imagined it would become a reason for humiliation, especially not from my own flesh and blood. Jason moved in with me about 6 months ago. He's my grandson, my late son Daniel's boy. After Daniel passed, Jason was the last bit of family I had left. When he asked if he could stay with me for a while, I said yes without hesitation. I thought it would be good for both of us. The house had grown so quiet since Daniel's funeral. I missed the laughter, the energy. I thought Jason would bring that back. In the beginning, he did. He was polite, soft-spoken, and kind. He'd help me carry groceries, mow the lawn, and we'd share tea on the porch in the evenings. I remember thinking, this is what family is supposed to feel like. But as weeks passed, that warmth faded. Jason started staying out late. He'd sleep until noon and spend his nights glued to his phone or playing games with friends online. I didn't complain much. I told myself he was young, that I had to be patient. I'd leave him notes sometimes, just reminders about small things. Dinner's in the fridge. Sweetheart, don't forget your doctor's appointment. Please lock the back door before bed. I always signed them with a little heart. And, Grandma. It was my way of showing love. I didn't realize those little notes would become the source of his laughter. One afternoon, I was cleaning the kitchen when I heard voices from the living room. Jason had a couple of his friends over. They were talking, laughing, the usual sound of youth that filled the house once more. But then I heard my name. Dude, look at this, Jason said, his voice dripping with amusement. I paused, my hand stilling over the counter. He was holding one of my notes. My own handwriting, my crooked, uneven script was being passed around like some kind of joke. She writes like a toddler with crayons, he said, and his friends burst out laughing. One of them mimicked the shaky loops of my letters in the air, pretending to struggle to hold an imaginary pen. I froze. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It was such a small thing, a few cruel words, but they pierced deeper than I ever thought possible. My hands trembled as I clutched the counter for balance. I wanted to walk in there, to say something, but my voice wouldn't come. I just stood in the kitchen doorway, half hidden, watching my grandson laugh at me. They didn't know I was there. Jason's laughter echoed through the room, light and careless. He was so caught up in the mockery that he didn't notice me standing behind him. When one of his friends asked where he got the note, he smirked and said, "She leaves these things everywhere. It's kind of pathetic." Pathetic. That word burned. I felt something inside me twist and crumble. I turned away quietly, retreating back to my room before anyone could see the tears welling in my eyes. I sat at my desk, staring at my wrinkled hands. The same hands that once comforted him when he fell and scraped his knee. The same hands that cooked his favorite meals, that wrapped his Christmas gifts, that wrote him letters when he went off to college. Those same hands were now a source of ridicule to him. For the first time, I looked at my handwriting through his eyes. I saw the uneven lines, the trembling strokes, the faint smudges of ink where my hand had slipped. I had always seen it as a part of me, imperfect but meaningful. Now, I saw shame. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the laughter, the way his friends looked at my note, the smirk on Jason's face. I wanted to believe it was just immaturity, that he didn't mean to hurt me. But deep down, something told me it wasn't just a careless moment. It was a reflection of who he'd become: entitled, insensitive, and cruel. In the morning, Jason acted as if nothing had happened. He greeted me casually, poured himself a bowl of cereal, and scrolled on his phone while eating. I stood there, watching him, my heart aching. I wanted to ask why he thought it was funny, why he would humiliate me like that. But I said nothing. I simply nodded and went about my day, pretending I hadn't heard a thing. It was easier to stay silent. But silence doesn't erase pain, it just buries it deeper. Later that afternoon, I called my friend Harriet. She's been my rock for over 30 years. When I told her what happened, she sighed and said, "Oh, Margaret, that boy doesn't know what he has. You've spoiled him with kindness. Maybe it's time he learns what happens when he takes someone's heart for granted. Her words stayed with me. Harriet was always blunt, sometimes painfully so, but she was never wrong. I looked down at my hands again that night, at the same trembling fingers that had been mocked, and I realized something. They might be weak, but they still held power. But Jason didn't know that his laughter had changed something inside me forever. I always believed that love could excuse a lot of pain until I realized mine was being taken for granted. After that day, things between Jason and me shifted, though he didn't seem to notice. His laughter still echoed in my mind, like a splinter that wouldn't work its way out. Every time I saw him sprawled on the couch or leaving his dirty dishes in the sink, that sound returned. It wasn't just laughter anymore, it was a reminder that the boy I once loved like my own son had stopped seeing me as a person. When you've lived as long as I have, you start to measure love in the quiet things. Meals cooked, bills paid, gentle reminders slipped under a door. I raised my son, Daniel, to understand that kind of love. He wasn't perfect, but he respected me. Even when we argued, he'd always say, "You're the strongest woman I know, Mom." That stayed with me. After Daniel's death, the world went gray. I still remember the day the police came to the door, their hats in their hands, their voices heavy with practiced sorrow. My knees gave out before they even said the words. That was 10 years ago, but the ache never left. Jason was only 14 then. I promised Daniel at his grave that I'd take care of him, no matter what. I kept that promise. I paid for Jason's education, helped him through college when his mother remarried and drifted away. I even sold my late husband's old car to help Jason pay off his credit card debt. He'd hugged me that day, promised he'd make me proud. For a while, I thought he meant it. But time has a cruel way of revealing people's true faces. The more I gave, the less he seemed to care. At first, I told myself that's just how young people are busy, distracted, always in their own worlds. I tried to make excuses for him. He was dealing with his father's loss. He was under pressure. He just needed space. But the excuses ran out the day I found him mocking my handwriting. It wasn't just about the letters on the paper, it was about everything I'd done for him being reduced to a punchline. I'd given him the best of me, and he'd turned it into a joke. I tried to talk to him one evening after dinner. He was sitting at the table, scrolling through his phone, the blue light washing over his face. I told him I wanted to discuss something serious. He didn't even look up. "Jason," I said softly, "do you know how it feels when someone you love laughs at you?" He glanced up, smirked slightly, and said, "Grandma, you're taking things too seriously. I wasn't trying to hurt you. It's just, your handwriting's kind of funny. No big deal. No big deal." Those 3 words stung more than the laughter. I nodded slowly and said, "It may not be a big deal to you, but it means something to me." He sighed, rolling his eyes, muttering, "You really need to relax. You're too sensitive." Then he stood, left his plate on the table, and disappeared into his room. I sat there alone for a long while, listening to the faint hum of his video games through the walls. I used to think silence was peaceful. Now it just felt heavy. The next morning, I called Harriet again. She was busy at the community center where she volunteered, but she always made time for me. I told her about our conversation, how cold he'd become. She didn't sound surprised. "That boy doesn't respect boundaries," she said. "You've given him everything, Margaret. When people get too comfortable, they stop valuing what's freely offered." I tried to defend him, said he was just young, that he'd grow out of it, but she cut me off. Love is not a license for disrespect. Her words echoed in my mind all day. That afternoon, I sat in my armchair by the window, watching the light move across the living room. Jason came and went as he pleased. Sometimes, he didn't even tell me where he was going. He'd mumble, heading out, and vanish for hours. When I asked if he'd eaten, he'd shrug. If I tried to talk, he'd put in his earbuds. The house that once felt warm now felt like I was living with a stranger. Still, I couldn't stop caring. Every night, I left dinner for him in the fridge. I folded his laundry. I even placed small notes again, hoping maybe one would reach the part of him that used to love me. But they always ended up in the trash. I found one crumpled near the couch one evening. It said, "Hope you're having a good day, love. Grandma." He hadn't even read it fully. I sat on the edge of the couch, clutching that piece of paper, and the tears came before I could stop them. I wasn't crying because he hurt me. I was crying because I realized I had allowed it. I had mistaken love for obligation, kindness for weakness. And the truth was, I wasn't helping him by forgiving everything. I was enabling him to become someone I no longer recognized. That night, I stared at my reflection in the mirror, gray hair, wrinkled skin, trembling hands, and said out loud, "You deserve better than this." My voice cracked, but it felt good to say it. Harriet was right. I had spent my whole life giving. Maybe it was time to start taking something back: my dignity, my peace, my control. I didn't know how yet, but deep down, I felt a quiet shift, like the ground beneath me was preparing for something new. I had no idea how right she was, and how deeply I'd regret ignoring her words. I decided to write again, not letters of love this time, but words that would make him listen. After that night, I couldn't shake the weight in my chest. Every glance at Jason reminded me of the boy he once was and the man he'd become. I used to think time softened people, made them gentler, but it seemed to have hardened him instead. There was no warmth in his voice anymore, only indifference. Still, I couldn't let go. I needed an outlet, a way to make sense of the storm quietly brewing inside me. So, I started writing again. It began one cold morning when the house was still and silent. Jason had gone out with friends, leaving the faint smell of his cologne hanging in the hallway. I sat at my old oak desk, the one my late husband built for me when I was still teaching. The wood was faded now, scratched from years of use, but it still held memories of happier days, letters written, essays graded, dreams scribbled in the margins of lesson plans. I pulled out a notebook and my favorite fountain pen, the one Daniel had given me for my 50th birthday. My hands trembled as I touched the pen to paper. The ink bled slightly at the start, as if hesitant, like me. The first line was messy, almost unreadable, but I didn't care. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't writing for anyone else. I was writing for me. I wrote about everything I'd held inside, the loneliness that crept in every evening when the television went silent, the ache of missing Daniel, the sting of Jason's laughter that still echoed through my thoughts. Each word came out shaky, uncertain but filled with truth. It wasn't beautiful, not in the way it used to be, but it was honest. And somehow, that made it sacred. As days passed, writing became my small rebellion. Every night after dinner, when Jason shut himself in his room, I'd return to that desk and pour my thoughts onto paper. I wrote about motherhood, about loss, about the pain of being forgotten by the very person I loved most. My handwriting wobbled and skipped, but every letter carried my heart in it. Sometimes, I'd pause and stare at the ink smudges on my fingers, remembering how Jason used to sit beside me as a child, practicing his own handwriting. Back then, he'd get frustrated when his letters weren't perfect, and I'd tell him, "It's not about perfection, sweetheart. It's about expression." Funny how that same lesson had vanished from his memory. One evening, as I wrote, I heard footsteps in the hallway. Jason's voice called out, "Grandma, you in there?" Before I could answer, he opened the door. My notebook was open on the desk, my words exposed. He leaned in, scanning the page. "What's this?" he asked, squinting. "Just my journal," I said softly. "I like to write before bed." He stepped closer, his lips curling into that familiar smirk. "You still writing those chicken scratches? Wow, Grandma, you really need to switch to typing." I felt a sting of humiliation crawl up my neck. "These words aren't for anyone else," I said quietly. He chuckled, shaking his head. "I'm just saying it's kind of sad you still bother when you can barely read it yourself." He snapped a quick picture of the page with his phone before I could stop him. "Jason!" I cried, reaching out, but he was already walking out of the room, laughing. That night, I couldn't sleep. The idea of him showing my words to someone, mocking me again, it broke something inside me that I didn't know could still break. I sat up in bed, staring at my trembling hands, and tears came without warning. I wasn't crying because he laughed. I was crying because he didn't care. He didn't understand what that writing meant to me, how it was the last piece of myself I still owned. The next morning, Harriet stopped by with muffins from the bakery. She could tell something was wrong the moment she saw me. "What happened?" she asked, setting the box on the counter. I told her everything: how Jason had found my journal, taken a picture, mocked me again. Her face hardened with anger. "That boy's forgotten who raised him," she said. "He needs to be reminded, and not with words. You've tried kindness, Margaret. It's time for something stronger." I shook my head. He's my grandson, Harriet. I can't just throw him out. I'm not saying that, she replied. But there are other ways to teach a lesson. Sometimes it's not what you say, it's what you leave behind. Her words lingered long after she left. That night, I went back to my writing. But this time, the words came out different, sharper, intentional. I wasn't writing to ease my pain anymore. I was writing to plan, to prepare. Each page felt like reclaiming a small part of myself. The pen that once trembled in fear now moved, with purpose. I wrote about legacy, about respect, about what people truly deserve when they've shown who they are. I didn't know where the words would lead me, but deep down, I felt something shift. My writing was no longer a reflection of weakness, it was becoming a quiet weapon. As I closed my journal that night, I felt a strange calm wash over me. I looked down at my shaky letters, inked in determination, and whispered to myself, he may laugh now, but one day, he'll understand. I tucked the notebook in the drawer of my desk and turned off the lamp. Outside, the wind brushed softly against the windows, carrying the faint scent of rain. I thought of Daniel, of how proud he'd once been of my strength. I wondered if he'd approve of the woman I was becoming, again someone who refused to be silenced. I smiled faintly, gripping my aching hands together, whispering a quiet promise to myself. That night, I decided that my handwriting would become my weapon. There's one thing Jason didn't know: I already had a will, but it was far from finished. The next morning began like any other. Jason left early, slamming the front door behind him without a word, and the silence he left behind was louder than his presence. I made myself a cup of tea, the same Earl Grey I've been drinking for decades, and sat by the window. The morning light poured in through the lace curtains, illuminating the dust particles drifting in the air. Everything looked still, but inside me, something had changed. I had spent so many years planning for everyone else, Daniel, Jason, even Jason's mother when she needed help, but never for myself. My husband, Robert, used to say, "Plan your peace while you still have the chance." I'd written my will years ago, right after his death, and tucked it away in my desk drawer. Back then, Jason was still a teenager. I'd thought I'd have plenty of time to update it, to pass on the home, the savings, the few heirlooms that mattered. But I hadn't touched it since. That day, I decided to take it out. The envelope was yellowed with age, the edges curling slightly. My name, Margaret Lee, was written in Robert's handwriting across the front. My heart clenched seeing those letters again. I ran my fingers over them, remembering his steady hand, his calm patience. He'd always been the practical one between us. A will isn't about death, he used to tell me. It's about making sure your life speaks even when you're gone. When I unfolded the document, I realized how outdated it was. The will left nearly everything to a local educational charity, a decision Robert and I made together back then. We'd agreed that if something happened to both of us, our modest savings and home should go to help children who couldn't afford schooling. It was a cause close to our hearts, both of us being teachers once upon a time. But when Daniel died, everything changed. I'd meant to rewrite the will and include Jason. He was, after all, our only grandchild. I wanted him to have the home, the inheritance, a piece of the life I'd built. I had even told him once that the house would be his someday. I remembered how his eyes had lit up at that. He'd said, "Guess that means I don't have to worry about rent in the future," and laughed. I'd laughed with him back then, not realizing how shallow that comment really was. Now, as I stared at the old papers, I felt something in my chest twist. That laughter, it wasn't gratitude, it was greed. I spread the pages across the desk, smoothing out the creases. My handwriting was still legible, then steady, neat, so different from the trembling lines I wrote with now. The contrast almost made me laugh bitterly. How strange that the thing Jason mocked, the very proof of my aging, was about to decide his future. I took out a clean sheet of paper and began drafting revisions. Slowly, painfully, my fingers cramped, and I had to stop every few lines, but I kept writing. It felt like reclaiming control, one stroke at a time. "Last will and testament of Margaret Lee," I wrote at the top. The words looked uneven but proud. As I wrote, memories of Jason's cruelty surfaced: his laughter, the photo he took of my journal, his casual disrespect. For a moment, I hesitated. Was it wrong to let anger guide me? But then I remembered Harriet's voice. "Love doesn't mean you let people walk all over you, Margaret. It means you know when to stop giving." She was right. I thought of the children who could benefit from this money, the ones struggling like my students once did. The thought warmed me. What had Jason done to earn this inheritance? Nothing. He mocked, took, demanded, and disrespected. My home meant something. My money meant something. And I refused to let it fall into the hands of someone who treated me like a joke. I wrote for hours, my hand aching, ink smudging under my trembling fingers. By the time the sun dipped behind the trees, I'd completed most of it. It wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be. It just needed to be mine. Every uneven letter carried intention. Every sentence was a boundary written in ink. When I finished, I looked over the draft carefully. The opening paragraph stated clearly who I was, and that this was my updated will. I adjusted the list of beneficiaries, leaving the bulk of my estate to the educational charity. I also added a special clause, a scholarship in Daniel's name. That part made me smile softly. His kindness would live on, even if his sons didn't. Jason's name didn't appear anywhere except once, in a line I'd crossed out. I stared at that black streak for a long moment, feeling both sorrow and satisfaction. It wasn't revenge, it was clarity. Before I sealed the pages, I read the last line aloud, my voice trembling. This document represents my final wishes, written by my own hand, witnessed and true. Fingers, leaving a small streak of ink across the desk. I didn't bother cleaning it. It felt like a signature of defiance. I tucked the will into a new envelope and wrote across it in slow, deliberate strokes, to be opened upon my passing. My handwriting looked as fragile as I felt, but it carried weight. Meaning, as I placed it in the top drawer of my desk, I exhaled deeply. My heart felt lighter, my mind sharper. For the first time in years, I didn't feel powerless. I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like a woman taking her story back. I poured myself another cup of tea and watched the twilight fade outside. The air felt clearer somehow. Peaceful. I smiled faintly, realizing he'd regret every word he'd ever mocked. Jason's mockery turned from casual jokes into something far darker. At first, I thought the laughter and teasing would fade with time, that maybe he'd realize how hurtful it had been. But instead, it grew worse, evolving into something colder, crueler. My grandson, the same boy I once held as an infant, began treating me like a burden rather than family. It started small. He'd sigh loudly whenever I asked for help carrying groceries. If I reminded him about chores, he'd mutter under his breath, "You're lucky I'm even here." I brushed it off, convincing myself he was stressed, that he didn't mean it. But deep down, I knew better. The respect that used to fill his voice when he said, "Grandma was gone." Now it was just a word, hollow and sharp, thrown at me like an insult. One afternoon, I overheard him on the phone in the living room. He was laughing again. "Yeah, living with her's basically like a museum exhibit," he told whoever was on the other end. "The old lady can barely write her name. I swear, her grocery lists look like cryptic runes or something." The person on the other end laughed, and so did he. I froze in the hallway, my hand pressed against the wall for balance. That same ache, familiar, now spread through my chest. I had given him everything I could, and this was how he spoke about me? Like I was some joke, some inconvenience? When he hung up, I stepped into the room. "Jason," I said quietly. He turned, startled. "How long have you been standing there?" "Long enough," I replied. He rolled his eyes. "Oh, come on, Grandma, it's not a big deal. I was just joking around." "That's the second time you've said that," I told him. "Do you ever stop to think that your jokes might actually hurt people?" He smirked. "You're too sensitive." Then he grabbed his keys and left without another word. I stood there for a long time after he was gone, listening to the faint rumble of his car fading into the distance. The house felt colder that evening. Days turned into weeks, and his behavior only worsened. He stopped saying thank you when I cooked for him. He left his messes everywhere, dishes piled high, laundry on the floor, wrappers stuffed behind the couch cushions. When I'd ask him to clean up, he'd grunt or ignore me altogether. Then one morning, I found something that made my heart sink lower than ever before. On the kitchen counter, where I usually left my notes for him, someone had scribbled a message, "Try writing this straight, Granny Scratch." The words were written in messy, exaggerated letters, mocking the unevenness of my own. I knew immediately it was Jason. I stood there, staring at the cruel little message, feeling my throat tighten. It wasn't just teasing anymore. It was deliberate. When he came downstairs later, I confronted him. "Did you write this?" I asked, holding up the note. He glanced at it and laughed. "Relax, Grandma. It's just a joke." "A joke?" My voice trembled, not with weakness this time, but with fury. "You're mocking me in my own home?" "Don't take it so personally," he said, brushing past me to grab a soda. "You're making a big deal out of nothing." Nothing. That word again. He didn't see it the way my hands shook, not from arthritis, but from anger. I wanted to yell, to tell him to pack his things and leave, but my voice caught in my throat. He wouldn't have cared anyway. His arrogance had drowned out whatever conscience he once had. That night, I sat in bed staring at my desk. The sealed envelope, the will, rested quietly in the drawer. Just seeing it there brought me a strange comfort. I'd already made my decision, even if Jason didn't know it yet. But still, part of me wished it didn't have to come to this. I'd wanted so badly for love to be enough. The next day, Harriet stopped by again. She could tell something was wrong from the look on my face. When I told her about the note on the counter, her expression hardened. "He's cruel, Margaret," she said flatly. "He's not a child anymore. He knows exactly what he's doing." "I know," I whispered. I can't understand how he became this way." "Maybe he's always been this way," she replied softly. "You just never had to see it before." Her words hit me hard. I realized she might be right. Maybe Jason's cruelty wasn't something new, it was something I'd chosen not to see, hidden under years of excuses and blind love. After she left, I sat alone in the kitchen, the house silent except for the ticking of the wall clock. Every tick sounded like a reminder of wasted time, of ignored warnings, of affection that had turned into pity. I reached for my pen and paper again. My fingers trembled as I wrote a single line. Sometimes love isn't about forgiveness. Sometimes it's about letting people face the consequences they've earned. I underlined the last word twice. When I set the pen down, I knew something inside me had shifted for good. I'd spent too long being silent, letting my kindness be mistaken for weakness. That would end soon. I folded the note and tucked it under my will. The words didn't look perfect, far from it, but they carried something Jason would never understand: intention. That night, I picked up my pen again with a plan forming in every trembling line. If my handwriting was his joke, it would also become his downfall. The idea came to me late one night, as I sat staring at the sealed envelope in my desk. I had already rewritten most of my will, but something about it still felt incomplete. It wasn't revenge I wanted, not exactly. What I wanted was for Jason to understand the weight of his cruelty, to feel the sting of what it meant to be dismissed, to have something precious mocked until it lost all meaning. I wanted my words, the same ones he'd ridiculed, to become the very thing that would humble him. So, I decided I would write my final will entirely by hand. No typewriters, no computers, no neat printed documents that a lawyer's assistant could produce. Just me, my pen, and the tremor in my fingers. If my handwriting was so unworthy in his eyes, then it would be the thing that sealed his fate. I remember sitting at my desk that night, the lamp casting a soft glow across the papers. My hands were shaking badly from the pain in my joints, but I didn't stop. Every letter I wrote came out uneven, each word wobbling across the page like it was alive. But to me, it looked beautiful. It looked real. I began carefully. "This document is my final will and testament, written by my own hand, of sound mind and clear intention. My late husband, Robert, had always said, 'If you want something to last, write it in ink.' And so I did, slowly, painfully, deliberately. I made sure there would be no misunderstanding about what I wanted. I named Harriet as my witness. She'd been there through every season of my life, and I knew she'd stand by my decision no matter what. The next morning, I called her over for tea and told her my plan. When she arrived, I handed her the papers. She adjusted her glasses and read through them quietly. After a few minutes, she looked up, her brow furrowed. "You're serious about this?" she said. "I am," I replied. "I've let him take everything from me except my voice. This," I gestured toward the will, "is me taking it back." She nodded slowly, understanding. "It's poetic in a way. The handwriting he mocked will be the same handwriting that changes his life forever." I smiled faintly. "Exactly." We spent the afternoon making sure every page was dated and signed properly. My arthritis made it hard to hold the pen for long, so Harriet helped steady the papers while I wrote. Each stroke of ink felt like carving truth into stone. When I came to the section with Jason's name, I paused. My hand hovered above the page, uncertain. For a fleeting moment, the memory of him as a child flashed before me, running through the backyard with scraped knees, his tiny hand gripping mine as he laughed. The softness of those days tugged at my heart. I wanted to forgive him. I truly did. But then, as if on cue, I remembered his voice mocking, careless, cruel. That memory hardened my resolve. I wrote his name once, then drew a slow, deliberate line through it. The black ink bled slightly, spreading over the letters until they vanished beneath it. My hand trembled as I whispered, "I hope one day you'll understand why." After that, I wrote in bold, shaky letters, "All remaining property and assets shall be donated to the street. Agnes Education Fund, in loving memory of Daniel Lee." It felt right, fitting. My son's name would live on in kindness, even if his child had forgotten what that meant. When the last line was written, I signed my name Margaret Lee at the bottom, pressing the pen down firmly enough that the nib scratched the paper. Harriet and another neighbor, Mrs. Collins, signed as witnesses. We all sat there in silence for a moment when it was done. Finally, I gathered the pages together, placed them in a clean white envelope, and sealed it. Across the front, I wrote, in my most careful script, "To be opened after my passing." Harriet touched my shoulder gently. "You sure you're ready for this?" she asked. I nodded. "I've been ready for a long time." Later that evening, as the house settled into its usual quiet, I placed the sealed envelope back into the top drawer of my desk. I poured myself a glass of water, sat in the armchair, and allowed myself a rare moment of calm. I had done it. My future and Jason's was written in my own imperfect hand. But life, as it always does, decided to test my resolve almost immediately. Just as I was drifting into thought, I heard footsteps in the hallway. Jason's voice cut through the silence. "Grandma?" he called. "What's this envelope?" My heart lurched. I turned toward the doorway and there he was, standing with the sealed will in his hands. He must have gone through my desk again. My chest tightened as I rose from the chair, forcing calm into my voice. "Put that down, Jason." He grinned. "Relax. I'm just curious. Looks official." He turned it over, squinting at my handwriting. "Oh wow, look at this penmanship. Guess you haven't improved much." I reached for the envelope. "That's private." He laughed lightly and held it out of reach. "What is it, another one of your dramatic letters?" "Jason," I said sharply. I said put it down. Something in my tone must have surprised him, because he finally lowered it into my hands. I looked him square in the eyes. "You'll know soon enough," I said softly. He frowned, confused, then shrugged and walked away, muttering, "You're weird sometimes, Grandma." When he disappeared down the hall, I clutched the envelope against my chest. My hands trembled, but not from fear this time. From power. He thought it was just another piece of paper, another silly relic from a woman too old to matter. He had no idea that his future, his comfort, his inheritance was sealed inside that very envelope, written in the handwriting he despised. And just as I finished, Jason walked in, smirking, unaware of what he'd just lost. Jason found the will before it was meant to be read. I should have hidden it better. That's what I kept telling myself later. But the truth is, I never thought he'd stoop that low. I'd always known Jason was careless, even selfish but disrespectful enough to rummage through his grandmother's private things. That was a new kind of betrayal. It happened on a Sunday afternoon. I was in the kitchen, humming softly while making tea. Harriet was supposed to stop by later for our usual chat. Jason had said he'd be working on a project in his room, which usually meant hours of loud video games and snacks strewn across the floor. I enjoyed the peace when he shut himself away. It gave me time to think. But that day, the house was too quiet, unnaturally so. I heard faint shuffling from the direction of my study. My heart sank before I even moved. I set the teapot down and walked toward the noise, my slippers barely making a sound on the floor. The door was open just enough for me to see inside. Jason was standing by my desk, his back turned to me, holding the sealed envelope in his hands. For a moment, I froze. My pulse quickened, my breath caught. He was turning it over, examining the writing like it was some kind of curiosity. I stepped into the room quietly. "Jason," I said. He startled, spinning around. "Oh, hey, Grandma," he said quickly, as if he hadn't just been caught doing something he shouldn't. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice calm but sharp. Nothing, he replied, slipping the envelope behind his back like a guilty child. I just found this lying here. It wasn't lying there, I said evenly. It was in my desk drawer. He laughed, an awkward, dismissive sound. Yeah, well, you left it half open. I was just curious. To be opened after my passing? What's that about? I took a step closer, holding out my hand. It's private, Jason. Please give it back. He didn't move at first. Instead, he smirked the same arrogant curl of his lips that I'd come to dread. You're not writing something weird again, are you? Another one of your dramatic notes? It's my will, I said firmly, and it's none of your concern right now. That made him pause. Your will? He repeated, blinking. Then, a spark of greed flickered in his eyes. Wait, so you're leaving me something, right? I stared at him, studying his expression. There wasn't an ounce of love there, just entitlement. Expectation. He looked at me not as his grandmother but as a source of money and property. Jason, I said slowly, I'm leaving behind what I believe is deserved. He frowned, confused, then scoffed. Well, I mean, it's not like you've got anyone else, right? I'm family. It's only fair. That word fair hit me like a slap. He'd never once cared about fairness when it came to how he treated me. Fair? I echoed quietly. You think fairness is about taking without giving anything in return? He shrugged, leaning against my desk like he owned the place. You've got no one else, Grandma. What's the point of donating stuff or whatever when you could make your grandson's life easier? I looked at him for a long moment. The boy I once knew, the sweet, curious child who used to sit at my knee while I told him stories, was gone. What stood before me now was a stranger wearing his face. You've already made your life easier at my expense, I said softly. And you haven't once said thank you. He rolled his eyes. Oh, come on, stop being so dramatic. You act like I've done something awful. I stepped closer. You have, I whispered. You've forgotten respect. You've forgotten gratitude. You've forgotten love. He let out a dry laugh. You're being ridiculous. You're old, Grandma. Not a saint. The words hit like knives, but I refused to flinch. And you're not a child anymore, I said. Start acting like it. For a brief moment, silence filled the room, heavy, suffocating. He stared at me, perhaps realizing he'd gone too far. But instead of apologizing, he scoffed again, breaking the tension. Whatever. Keep your secrets. I don't care what's in your will. I'll find out eventually. He turned to leave, but before he did, I spoke one last time. You'll know soon enough, I said quietly. He froze for a second, glanced back at me, and muttered, You're weird sometimes, Grandma. Then he walked out, the sound of his footsteps echoing down the hall. When the door closed behind him, I sat at my desk, my hands trembling. I resealed the envelope, smoothing the edges carefully, and placed it back in the drawer, this time locking it. My chest ached, not from anger but from grief. I thought of Daniel, of the love he'd shown me even in his hardest years. He would have been ashamed to see his son this way. I stared at the envelope for a long while, knowing the truth it carried. Jason thought he was untouchable, that my frailty meant I had no strength left to fight. He couldn't have been more wrong. By the time Harriet arrived later that evening, I'd already decided I would make sure everything was finalized and legally witnessed within the week. I wanted no room for arguments, no chance for him to twist my intentions. As Harriet poured us both tea, she looked at me and said, You look calm, Margaret, like someone who's made peace with something. I smiled faintly. I have. Because in that moment, I knew Jason's arrogance had written his own ending, he just hadn't read it yet. But his curiosity would soon cost him everything. I felt strangely peaceful after that night, as if the decision had set me free. For the first time in months, I woke up without that heavy knot of resentment in my chest. The confrontation with Jason had left a strange silence between us, but it was the kind of silence I could finally breathe in. He avoided me for the next few days, barely speaking, only muttering quick hellos when passing through the kitchen. Fine by me. I was done chasing affection that didn't exist. The house was quiet, almost too quiet. Yet, in that stillness, I found my clarity. I began each morning with tea on the porch, listening to the rustling of the trees and the distant hum of cars. The air was cool, crisp, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't dread the day ahead. Jason, on the other hand, grew more restless. He spent longer hours out, often returning late at night smelling of alcohol and smoke. He thought I didn't notice, but I always did. The faint creak of the door at midnight, the clumsy footsteps down the hall, it all painted the same picture. He was spiraling, though I suspected he didn't even realize it. One morning, I found him rummaging through the pantry, his eyes bloodshot. "Rough night?" I asked softly. He didn't answer, just shrugged. "Can you lend me some cash? I need gas money." "You already owe me for last week," I reminded him gently. He groaned, running a hand through his hair. "You're seriously going to get stingy now? You've got plenty, Grandma." "Enough," I said, my voice steady. "You're an adult. You need to start being responsible." He shot me a glare but didn't argue. Instead, he grabbed his keys and stormed out. The door slammed so hard that one of the picture frames on the wall tilted sideways. I stood there for a long moment, staring at that crooked frame, realizing how symbolic it was. Everything between us was tilted now, slightly off balance. But I didn't try to fix it this time. I simply straightened the frame and whispered to myself, "Let it be." That afternoon, Harriet came by for lunch. I told her about Jason's behavior, about how detached he'd become. She frowned but smiled softly when she saw the calm on my face. "You seem different, Margaret," she said. "Lighter, somehow." I nodded. I think I finally stopped hoping he'd change. That's not an easy thing to do. "No," I agreed. "But sometimes peace means giving up the version of people you imagined they could be." We spent the rest of the afternoon talking about her grandchildren and the upcoming charity auction at the Street Agnes Education Fund. It made me smile to hear about it, knowing that soon, my own legacy would help keep that fund alive long after I was gone. I didn't tell Harriet this part, but I'd already mailed a certified copy of my handwritten will to my lawyer, Mr. Henson. He was an old family friend and had promised to review it personally. "As long as your handwriting is clear enough to show intent," he'd told me, "it'll be honored." I smiled when he said that. Intent. If only Jason knew how much intent my handwriting carried. In the evenings, I went back to writing small letters to myself, to Daniel, even to Jason. I didn't expect him to read them, but the act of writing soothed me. My words had always been my refuge. My trembling hand still ached, but now, each stroke of ink felt like a step toward closure. Days passed quietly. The tension in the house became bearable, like background noise. Jason barely looked at me anymore, though I caught him glancing toward the study a few times. Perhaps curiosity still gnawed at him, maybe greed, or maybe, deep down, he knew something had changed and didn't like that the power was no longer his. One evening, as I watered my garden, he came outside unexpectedly. "You know, Grandma," he said, leaning on the porch railing, "you don't have to be so secretive about your money." I looked up, meeting his gaze. "Not secrecy," I said calmly. "It's privacy." He chuckled dryly. "Same thing, isn't it?" "No," I replied, setting down the watering can. "Privacy is something you earn by respecting boundaries. Secrecy is what you create when you violate them." He blinked, confused by my response. "You sound like one of those old TV therapists," he muttered before heading back inside. I watched him go, feeling a pang of sadness but only for a moment. I wasn't angry anymore, just disappointed. That night, I sat on the porch long after the sun went down, listening to the wind brushing through the trees. I thought about all the years I'd spent trying to protect Jason from the world, only to realize he needed protection from himself. It wasn't my job anymore to save him. My job now was to make sure he learned what love without respect truly cost. The next morning, I drove to Mr. Henson's office. He greeted me with a warm smile and offered me tea while he reviewed my documents. "This is solid, Margaret," he said, scanning the pages. "Handwritten wills have a certain poetry to them, a personal touch. You've made your wishes clear." I smiled faintly. "That's all I wanted, to make sure my voice can't be ignored." He nodded approvingly. "It won't be. You've done everything right." When I left his office, the air outside felt fresh and alive. The clouds were heavy, hinting at rain, but the light that filtered through them seemed soft, almost forgiving. I stood for a moment, taking it all in, knowing I had finally done what needed to be done. Back home, the house felt different. Peaceful, but with an undercurrent of something else, something I couldn't quite name. I busied myself with small chores, cleaning, watering plants, and sorting through old photo albums. I came across a picture of Jason as a little boy, sitting on Robert's shoulders, laughing without a care in the world. I traced the outline of his smile with my finger and whispered, "Where did you go, my boy?" Tears pricked my eyes, but I didn't let them fall. I folded the photo gently and placed it inside my journal. Some memories were meant to stay close to the heart, even when they hurt. That night, as I prepared for bed, the house seemed unusually still. The wind outside was calm, the ticking clock in the hallway steady. I felt at peace. I'd done all I could, said all I needed to say both in life and on paper. But peace, I would soon learn, is fragile. It never lasts as long as you want it to. I had no idea that fate was preparing to take its final turn. It happened so suddenly, like a chapter ending mid-sentence. It was a bright morning, one of those deceptive ones where everything seems still, gentle, and harmless. The kind of morning that fools you into thinking nothing bad could ever happen. I remember the sky was perfectly clear, and the air smelled faintly of lilacs from the bush Robert planted years ago. I just finished my tea and decided to tend to my garden. Gardening always calmed me. It made me feel useful, grounded, alive. The soil was soft from last night's rain, and I hummed as I trimmed the hedges. Jason was still asleep or pretending to be. His car was in the driveway, his shoes by the door. I'd learned not to expect much interaction from him before noon. That silence had become my normal. I bent down to pull a stubborn weed from the flower bed, and that's when it happened. A sharp pain shot up my hip, so sudden, so violent, that I gasped. The next thing I knew, the world tilted, the sky spun, and I was on the ground. The sound of the fall, dull, heavy, final, echoed in my ears. For a moment, I couldn't move. My breath came in shallow bursts. The pain radiated from my side like fire, blinding and hot. My hand scrabbled in the dirt, searching for something to grip, but all I felt were crushed petals and damp soil. "Jason!" I tried to call, but my voice came out weak, strangled. "Jason!" There was no answer, only the faint hum of the lawnmower from a few houses down and the chirping of birds. I lay there for what felt like an eternity before I finally heard the door creak open. Jason's voice drifted out, lazy and annoyed. "What now, Grandma?" He appeared on the porch, squinting at me. For a second, his expression was confusion, then irritation. "What are you doing on the ground?" I fell. I managed to say, my voice trembling. "My hip, I think it's broken." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Seriously?" I was just about to go out. "Please," I whispered. "Help me." He hesitated for a moment, then walked toward me. His steps were slow, unhurried. He knelt beside me, muttering, "You really need to be more careful, Grandma." His tone was flat, almost resentful, as if my injury had inconvenienced him. I wanted to cry, but the pain was too much. He helped me up halfway, then groaned. "You're heavier than you look," he complained. I bit my lip, refusing to respond. When he finally got me into the car, I could barely hold back tears. The movement sent bolts of agony through my side. At the hospital, everything blurred together, the blinding white lights, the sterile smell, the endless questions from nurses. I drifted in and out of consciousness as doctors examined me. A fractured hip, they said. Surgery would be needed. Days in recovery. Weeks before I could walk again. Jason sat in the waiting room, scrolling on his phone. When the nurse asked for my emergency contact, he barely looked up. "Yeah, that's me," he muttered. His face was pale, not from worry, but from boredom. When they wheeled me into my room later that day, I spotted him leaning against the wall, tapping his foot impatiently. "So, how long is this going to take?" he asked. I blinked at him. "I'm not sure. The doctor said recovery will take time." He sighed dramatically. "Great, guess. I'll be stuck here helping you for weeks." It wasn't what he said, it was how he said it. Like my pain was some burden he had to carry. My throat tightened, and I turned my face toward the window, hiding the tears welling in my eyes. Harriet arrived that evening, her face etched with concern. The moment she saw me, she rushed to my side, taking my hand. "Oh, Margaret," she whispered. "You poor thing. What happened?" "I fell," I said softly. "In the garden." She turned toward Jason, who was still scrolling on his phone in the corner. "Were you home when it happened?" she asked pointedly. He looked up, annoyed. "Yeah, I got her here, didn't I?" Harriet's eyes narrowed slightly, but she said nothing more. After he left to get food, she leaned closer to me. "You don't need to worry about anything. she said firmly. I'll make sure your affairs are handled while you recover. I squeezed her hand weakly. There's an envelope, I whispered. In my desk drawer. Please, make sure Mr. Henson gets it if anything happens. She nodded solemnly. I will, Margaret. I promise. For the first time in days, I allowed myself to close my eyes, knowing at least one person still cared enough to listen. The next few days were a blur of medication, hospital noise, and brief visits from Jason. Each time he seemed more distant. One day, I overheard him asking a nurse when I'd be discharged and out of the way. My heart broke all over again. Lying there, surrounded by machines and white walls, I realized the truth I'd been avoiding for so long. Jason wasn't lost. He had chosen who he was becoming, and I couldn't save him from that. That night, Harriet visited again. She held my hand and told me she'd spoken to Mr. Henson. Everything's in motion, she said softly. I nodded, my voice barely above a whisper. Good. The next morning, the nurse brought in a clipboard for me to sign a few forms. As I held the pen, my hand trembled, but I steadied it against the paper. Slowly, deliberately, I signed my name, Margaret Lee, just as I had on every page of that will. The ink shimmered faintly in the light, a final declaration of intent. And that night, I signed the final page of my will from my hospital bed. I didn't think I'd make it out of the hospital alive. The days after my surgery passed in a blur of soft beeping machines, the murmur of nurses, and the faint smell of antiseptic that clung to everything. The pain was sharp and constant, but not as sharp as the ache in my heart. There's a strange kind of loneliness that comes with hospital rooms. Time stretches endlessly, and every sound echoes like a reminder of how fragile you've become. Jason visited only twice in the first week. The first time, he walked in halfway through lunch, scrolling on his phone as if my room were a waiting area instead of where his grandmother was fighting to heal. Hey, he said casually, barely glancing up. Hello, Jason, I whispered, setting down my spoon. I wasn't sure I'd see you today. Yeah, I've been busy, he said, pulling up a chair without sitting in it. How long do you have to stay here anyway? The doctor says another week or two, depending on my recovery, he sighed. Great. I've been watching the house. It's kind of boring there, you know? I just nodded, too tired to argue. I wanted him to show some concern, to ask if I was in pain, to care even a little, but all I got was a distracted, impatient grandson, scrolling and sighing between half-hearted sentences. After 10 minutes, he stood. All right, I should get going. Text me if you need anything. He didn't even notice that I didn't own a cell phone. The second time he came, 3 days later, he brought flowers, but they weren't for me. They were the cheap kind, still wrapped in plastic, probably picked up from the gas station near the hospital. He dropped them on the table, said, "Thought this room could use some color," and sat down. He stayed maybe 15 minutes, mostly talking about himself, his plans, his frustrations. When he finally left, the silence that followed felt merciful. But Harriet, she was there almost every day. She'd bring me tea from home, warm muffins, and the kind of comfort that doesn't need to be spoken. Sometimes she'd sit quietly by my bedside, knitting or reading aloud from one of my old favorite books. I told her she didn't have to come so often, but she only smiled and said, "You'd do the same for me." One evening, as the sun began to set outside my window, painting the sky in streaks of gold and crimson, I felt a heaviness settle over me. My body was tired, too tired. My breaths came slower, shallower. I tried to hide it from the nurses, but Harriet could see it in my face. "Margaret," she said softly, leaning closer. "Don't you start giving up on me now." I smiled weakly. "I'm not giving up, dear. I'm just getting ready." She gripped my hand tightly. "You've still got more to do, more to see." I shook my head. "No, Harriet. Everything that needed to be done is already written." I reached for the small notebook I kept by my bedside. My fingers trembled as I flipped to the last page. There, in shaky but deliberate handwriting, I wrote, "To Jason, respect is written, not spoken." Those words had come to me in the middle of the night, days earlier, and I knew they were the last I'd ever write. It wasn't anger behind them, it was truth. He had spent so long talking about respect, money, and family, but he'd never understood what any of it meant. Maybe, when he saw those words, he finally would. I slipped the note into a small envelope and sealed it carefully. Then I reached into the drawer beside my bed and took out a folded copy of the first page of my will, the one that bore my title, my name, and the words, "Last. Will and Testament of Margaret Lee." I placed the note inside that same envelope and wrote his name across the front, Jason Lee. When Harriet saw what I was doing, tears filled her eyes. "You're giving him a chance to learn, aren't you?" "Yes," I whispered. "Even if I'm not around to see it." She nodded slowly, taking the envelope when I handed it to her. "I'll make sure he gets it, I promise." "Thank you," I said, my voice barely a breath. "And please, tell him I loved him, even when he didn't deserve it." Harriet pressed my hand to her cheek, her tears falling softly onto my skin. "He'll know. Somehow, he'll know." After she left that night, I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor beside me. It reminded me of the ticking clock back home, steady, constant, unforgiving. I thought about Daniel, about the promise I made to him all those years ago to look after his boy. I had done my best. Maybe my best hadn't been enough, but at least now, there was peace in knowing that Jason would face the truth, even if he didn't want to. My eyelids grew heavy, and a strange calm washed over me. The air around me seemed softer, almost forgiving. I wasn't afraid anymore. I'd lived a long life, a good life, even with its cracks and sorrows. I had made my mistakes, but I had also made things right, in the only way I could. As the light dimmed, I whispered a silent prayer. Not for myself, but for Jason, that someday he would remember the love that raised him, the kindness that asked for nothing, and the handwriting that spoke louder than any voice. The machines hummed quietly beside me. The world outside carried on, cars passing, nurses walking the halls, someone laughing in another room. But I drifted into that stillness between moments, where everything is peaceful and infinite. And in that silence, I knew my handwriting would speak louder than I ever could. They said my funeral was small, but meaningful. I wasn't there, of course not in body anyway. But if there's one thing I've come to believe, it's that love lingers long after breath leaves the body. Harriet told me later how it all went, and in her words, I could almost see it unfold as if I'd been standing there among them. It was a mild afternoon, the kind of day I used to love: overcast skies, cool breeze, not too bright. The church was modest but warm, with wooden pews that had seen generations come and go. A handful of faces filled the small space: Harriet, Mr. Henson, a few of my old neighbors, and two of my former students who had grown into kind adults. That was all. I'd lived long enough to know that, in the end, only those who truly care ever show up. Harriet said the service was quiet, filled with gentle words and familiar hymns. The pastor spoke about kindness, patience, and dignity. He didn't mention Jason, perhaps he didn't even know about him, but Harriet did. She said she caught sight of him at the back of the church, slouched in the pew, wearing dark sunglasses indoors as if to hide the fact that he'd rather be anywhere else. He'd arrived late, during the final hymn, and stayed near the door. No flowers, no condolences, just a half-hearted presence that told everyone exactly where his mind was. When the pastor invited anyone to speak about my life, Jason kept his eyes on the floor. Harriet wanted to be angry, but she couldn't. She said she just felt sorry for him. When the service ended, most of the guests came to Harriet with soft smiles, sharing memories of me, how I'd helped them with their studies, written them notes of encouragement, or dropped off soup when they were sick. She was one of the good ones, someone said, and Harriet's eyes filled with tears. Outside, the sky threatened rain as the casket was lowered into the ground. Harriet stood closest, holding a small white rose. Jason lingered a few steps away, hands shoved in his pockets, staring down at the ground as though it might give him the answers he was too afraid to face. After the burial, Mr. Henson approached Harriet. His voice was quiet, respectful. "Margaret left something," he said, handing her a sealed envelope. It was the same one I'd given her before my final night, the one marked for Jason Lee. Harriet hesitated. "Should I give it to him now?" Mr. Henson nodded. "It's what she wanted." Jason was leaning against his car when she approached. He looked impatient, scrolling through his phone. Harriet stood before him, her expression unreadable. "Your grandmother left this for you," she said, extending the envelope. Jason glanced up, confused. "What is it?" "Why don't you open it and find out?" she said simply. He took it reluctantly, examining the shaky handwriting on the front. My handwriting. I can imagine the look on his face as he read his name written in those uneven, trembling letters he'd once mocked. Seriously? He muttered, almost scoffing. She couldn't have just typed it? Harriet crossed her arms. Show some respect. Jason tore the envelope open with a careless flick of his fingers. Inside, he found my short handwritten note. Respect is written, not spoken. And beneath it, the folded title page of my will, the last will and testament of Margaret Lee. He frowned, confused. What is this supposed to mean? Harriet said nothing. She just watched him as the realization began to dawn on his face. For a few seconds he stood perfectly still. Then he laughed, a short, nervous laugh that didn't sound like humor at all. This is just like her, he muttered under his breath. Always with the dramatic lessons. He crumpled the envelope slightly in his fist, his eyes darting toward the lawyer, who was standing a few feet away. She's not serious, right? I mean, there's an actual will, yeah? Mr. Henson nodded. Yes, and it will. Be read in my office tomorrow morning at 10. You're welcome to attend. Jason forced a tight smile, the kind that never reaches the eyes. Yeah, sure. Of course. As he climbed into his car, Harriet said quietly, You should read that note again, Jason. Maybe this time, you'll understand it. He didn't answer. He just started the engine and drove off, the tires kicking up dust along the narrow road that led away from the cemetery. Harriet stood there long after the car disappeared. The rain finally began to fall soft at first, then steady. She told me later that as the drops hit the freshly turned soil above my grave, she thought of how I used to say that rain after a burial meant peace for the departed. She smiled at that, even through her tears. Mr. Henson placed a hand on her shoulder. She was a remarkable woman, he said. She knew exactly what she was doing. I know, Harriet replied softly. And tomorrow so will he. As everyone left, the cemetery grew quiet again, except for the gentle patter of rain against the headstones. Somewhere nearby, a wind chime tinkled faintly in the breeze. If I could have spoken then, I would have told them not to cry, that this wasn't the end. My handwriting still had one last thing to say. His laughter stopped as he began to read. Every stroke of my pen told the story he refused to hear. The following morning, Jason arrived at Mr. Henson's law office 15 minutes late. Harriet was already there, sitting in one of the wooden chairs near the front, her hands folded in her lap. Mr. Henson stood behind his desk, dignified as always, his gray hair combed neatly back and his glasses perched low on his nose. The mood in the room was heavy, the kind of quiet that seems to hold its breath. Jason entered with the same casual arrogance he carried everywhere. He wore a wrinkled shirt and jeans, his sunglasses tucked into his collar, his phone still in his hand. Sorry, he muttered, not really meaning it. Traffic. Mr. Henson nodded politely. That's quite all right. Please, have a seat. Jason dropped into the chair opposite the lawyer, glancing briefly at the stack of papers on the desk. His eyes flickered with something between curiosity and impatience. So, how does this work? You just read it out loud? That's correct, Mr. Henson replied. Your grandmother left a detailed will, handwritten, in her own words. She requested that it be read in full before any documents are distributed. Jason scoffed softly. Handwritten, huh? Figures. Harriet shot him a glare, but Mr. Henson pretended not to hear. He adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and began. This is the last will and testament of Margaret Lee, he read, his voice steady and deliberate. Written and signed by my own hand, of sound mind and full awareness. Jason leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. He looked bored already, glancing occasionally at his phone. As I put my affairs in order, Mr. Henson continued, I do so not with sorrow but with purpose. I have lived a full life, surrounded by love, kindness, and memories that shaped me into who I am. I wish to leave behind not only what I have, but what I've learned. Harriet smiled faintly, tears already glistening in her eyes. Jason rolled his eyes. Is there a point to this, or is it just a speech? Mr. Henson ignored the interruption and kept reading. To my dear friend Harriet Sanders, who stood by me through joy and hardship alike, I leave my mother's pearl necklace and the silver tea set from my wedding. They belong to loyalty, not blood. Harriet pressed a trembling hand to her chest, whispering, Oh, Margaret, Mr. Henson continued. To the Street Agnes Education Fund, I leave the sum of $120,000, to establish a scholarship in the name of my son, Daniel Lee. May it help others reach for the opportunities he never got to see fulfilled. Jason straightened slightly in his chair, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. Wait, what about me? Mr. Henson turned the page slowly. We'll get there, he said calmly. The room grew quieter as he continued reading, each word deliberate. To my grandson, Jason Lee. Jason smirked and leaned forward, as if finally hearing what he'd come for. Here we go. I wish you peace, growth, and the understanding that love without respect is empty. For years, I believed that kindness could heal every wound, but I have learned that some lessons require silence, and some respect must be earned, not inherited. Jason frowned. What does that mean? Mr. Henson's eyes met his briefly, then returned to the page. I leave to you, Jason, the most valuable thing I own, the pen I used to write this will. Jason blinked. What? Harriet looked down, holding back a sigh. Mr. Henson continued, reading Margaret's words exactly as written. It may seem small, even meaningless, but this pen holds every word of my truth, every letter, every stroke, every tremor of my hand that you once mocked. If you ever wish to understand me, look closely at the ink. That's where you'll find everything you never cared to see. Jason's jaw tightened. You're joking, he said flatly. There's no way, that's all. I assure you, Mr. Henson replied. This is her clear and final statement. Her assets have been fully allocated to the beneficiaries listed before you. Jason slammed his hand on the armrest. So I get nothing? Nothing at all? Mr. Henson folded the papers neatly and placed them on the desk. You get exactly what she intended you to have. Jason laughed bitterly, shaking his head. This is insane. She can't actually do that. I'm her family. Blood alone does not entitle anyone to another person's legacy, Mr. Henson said quietly. Your grandmother understood that. Harriet finally spoke, her voice soft but firm. She loved you, Jason. More than you'll ever know. But love isn't blind. It sees everything and forgives until it can't anymore. Jason stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. You all think this is funny, don't you? That she's teaching me some kind of lesson from the grave? No, Harriet replied, her eyes steady. She's giving you a second chance. Jason clenched his jaw, his eyes flicking between Harriet and Mr. Henson. You're all crazy, he muttered, turning toward the door. Before he left, Mr. Henson called out, Wait, there's one more item. Jason stopped, his hand on the doorknob. Mr. Henson reached into a drawer and pulled out a small velvet box. This is yours. Jason hesitated, then took it. When he opened it, he found an old, slightly worn fountain pen resting inside. The same one he'd seen her use countless times. The one he'd laughed about. He stared at it for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then, without another word, he closed the box and walked out. The office door shut behind him, leaving Harriet and Mr. Henson in silence. Harriet wiped a tear from her cheek. Do you think he'll ever understand? She asked. Mr. Henson sighed softly. In time, perhaps. She wrote her truth in a language he never bothered to learn. Outside, Jason sat in his car, gripping the velvet box in his hand. He wanted to throw it, to scream, to curse her name, but he couldn't. Something in him broke as he opened the box again, and stared at that trembling signature etched forever into his memory. He looked down at the pen, realizing too late what he'd thrown away. Jason never mocked handwriting again. After the will reading, everything seemed to unravel for him. Harriet told me how pale he looked as he left the lawyer's office that day, his expression blank, his steps unsteady. It was as if the ground had shifted beneath him, and he didn't know how to walk anymore. He'd gone there expecting wealth, comfort, and control. What he found instead was the echo of his own cruelty staring back at him through ink and paper. In the days that followed, the small town whispered, "People always do." They talked about how the old school teacher, Margaret Lee, had left her fortune to a charity instead of her own blood. Some said it was heartless. Others said it was justice. But Harriet knew the truth. It wasn't about revenge. It was about teaching a lesson the world had failed to give him. Jason tried to hide from the gossip. He stayed inside for days, curtains drawn, phone turned off. The same neighbors he once ignored now spoke about him in hushed tones. They said they saw him pacing late at night, standing on the porch with that little velvet box in his hand. When he finally resurfaced, It wasn't to apologize or explain, it was to fight. He walked into Mr. Henson's office, demanding a meeting. Harriet happened to be there that day, signing the scholarship paperwork. She said his voice was full of bitterness, but also desperation. She didn't know what she was doing, Jason shouted, slamming his palm on the desk. She was old, confused. That will can't be real, it's basically illegible. Mr. Henson didn't flinch. Her handwriting was shaky, yes, but her words were clear. It was legally witnessed, signed, and verified. It stands, Jason, he scoffed. So that's it? I get nothing because she couldn't write properly? Mr. Henson adjusted his glasses calmly. No, you get nothing because you couldn't treat her properly. The room fell silent after that. Harriet said she saw something flicker across Jason's face, then not anger, but guilt. Real, heavy guilt. The kind that sits in the gut and doesn't leave. He muttered something under his breath and stormed out. The following week, he tried to contest the will formally, but it didn't last long. The court dismissed it almost immediately. The document was valid in every way. Her words, though written in trembling lines, carried the full weight of the law. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The handwriting he mocked was now the handwriting that had defeated him. News spread quickly. Local papers even ran a small piece about it, former teacher Lee's legacy of kindness to students. It spoke of the new Daniel Lee Scholarship, how it would fund the education of underprivileged children every year. Donations began pouring in from people who'd known me, students, parents, colleagues, and even strangers who'd read the story. Within months, the scholarship fund had doubled. Harriet oversaw the first award ceremony herself. She said, standing at that podium, seeing those young faces full of hope, made her feel like I was right there beside her. The first recipient, a bright girl named Clara, wrote a thank you letter that brought Harriet to tears. Your handwriting may have been shaky, the letter said, but your love was steady. I'll carry that with me always. Meanwhile, Jason disappeared from public view. He sold his car, left his job, and moved out of town. No one heard much about him for a long time. Harriet said she'd sometimes wonder where he'd gone, whether he'd learned anything from what happened. But she didn't ask. Some lessons have to grow in silence. Months later, a letter arrived at Harriet's doorstep. The envelope was plain, but the handwriting on the front made her freeze. It was neat, careful, deliberate, but unmistakably Jason's. She told me she stood there for several minutes before opening it. Inside, she found a short note. It read, "Dear Harriet, I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know that I understand now. She wasn't punishing me, she was teaching me. I laughed at her handwriting because I didn't see the strength behind it. I thought shaky meant weak. I was wrong. I found her pen again today. I've been holding it for weeks, afraid to touch it. But this morning, I wrote something. My first letter in years. And for the first time, I didn't care how it looked. I just wrote. She said respect is written, not spoken. I get it now. Please tell her, somehow, that I'm sorry. Jason," Harriet cried as she read it. She said she could almost hear my voice laughing softly beside her, whispering, "He finally learned." Jason never returned to town, but every December, a quiet donation would appear in the Daniel Lee Scholarship Fund. No name, no message, just a simple note enclosed in each envelope. In honor of handwriting that never fades, Harriet kept one of those notes, tucked safely inside her prayer book. She said the handwriting was still uneven, but each line was steady with meaning. The world moved on, as it always does. The scholarship grew. The story of the old teacher and her grandson became one of those small-town tales people shared over coffee, half lesson, half legend. Some pitied Jason, others praised me. But I think, in the end, both of us found what we needed. He found humility, and I found peace. And in that letter, he called my handwriting beautiful. Even after death, my words continued to speak. Harriet once told me that legacies don't live in buildings or bank accounts, they live in hearts. If that's true, then mine must have lived in hers for a long while. She visited my grave often, always bringing a single white rose and a cup of tea she never drank. She'd sit by the headstone, brushing away fallen leaves, and talk as though I were still sitting across from her at my kitchen table. "Your scholarship's growing faster than either of us imagined," she told me once, tracing her fingers along the engraved letters of my name. "You'd be proud, Margaret, you really would." The Daniel Lee Scholarship Fund had become something beautiful. What began as a quiet act of defiance turned into a ripple that spread far beyond what anyone expected. Students wrote letters, local businesses contributed, and even the mayor attended the annual award ceremonies. They hung my photo in the school library with a plaque that read, "In memory of Margaret Lee, a teacher whose words never stopped teaching." Harriet loved telling me about those ceremonies. She'd laugh, saying, "You'd hate the attention, Margaret. You were always too modest for your own good." And she was right. I never wanted glory. I only wanted understanding to prove that words, even written with shaking hands, could still change a life. And in some strange poetic way, they did. Every December, another anonymous donation arrived for the scholarship No Name, just a handwritten note that read, "For the hands that taught me what strength really looks like." Harriet never told anyone who sent them, but she knew, and so did I. Jason hadn't disappeared completely. He'd moved to another city, found work at a small hardware store, and started over quietly. He didn't talk much about his past, but the people who met him said he was polite, gentle, and surprisingly patient. No one would have guessed the bitterness he once carried. Harriet received another letter from him 2 years later. She kept it sealed for a few days, unsure whether to open it. When she finally did, the pages were filled with neat, careful handwriting letters shaped by effort, not perfection. "Dear Harriet, I visited her grave today. I brought the pen. It still works, you know? I didn't think it would after all these years, but the ink came out smooth. I wrote her a letter right there in the grass. It wasn't fancy, and my hand shook the whole time, but it felt right. I finally understand what she meant. I used to think handwriting was just lines and letters, but hers, it was more than that. Every wobble meant something. Every uneven word carried love, patience, and strength I didn't deserve. I've been helping at a local literacy center on weekends, teaching kids how to write by hand. I tell them about a woman who once taught me what real grace looks like. I never say her name, but every time I do it, I feel like she's standing beside me. She gave me nothing but truth, and it's the most valuable thing anyone's ever given me. Thank you for being there when I wasn't. Thank you for keeping her promise." Jason. When Harriet finished reading, she wept not out of sorrow, but pride. She folded the letter carefully and tucked it beside the first one he'd sent, both sealed in an envelope marked Margaret's Peace. Years passed, and the world changed, as it always does. Technology grew faster, handwriting became rarer, and people forgot what it felt like to hold a pen for anything longer than a signature. But still, at Agnes School, children wrote letters every spring in honor of the scholarship's founder. Their teachers would say, "Today we write like Mrs. Lee," and every classroom would fall into the soft hum of pens scratching paper. Harriet grew old, too, her hair silver and her hands soft with age. On her last visit to my grave, she smiled and said, "You know, Margaret, I think your handwriting outlived us all." She left a small stack of those student letters by the headstone, bright paper covered in crooked, beautiful handwriting. Each word, a quiet echo of the woman who once refused to type her story. As for Jason, he never remarried, never sought out the wealth he once dreamed of, but he lived differently. Every year, on the anniversary of my death, he returned to that same cemetery. He'd kneel beside the stone, place the pen on the grass for a moment, and whisper, "Thank you." Then he'd tuck it back into his pocket and walk away. They say people change slowly, like erosion bit by bit. But sometimes, one moment, one truth, one act of grace, is enough to carve a person into something entirely new. My handwriting, my frail, imperfect handwriting had done what words alone could not. It had lived beyond the laughter, beyond the cruelty, beyond the grave. I imagine that someday, when Jason's hands are old and his writing begins to shake like mine once did, he'll smile instead of sneer. Maybe he'll see beauty in the tremor, the story in every imperfect line. Maybe he'll remember that love isn't measured in neatness, it's measured in effort. And maybe, just maybe, he'll pick up that same pen and write a letter to someone he loves. Because handwriting fades, paper yellows, ink bleeds, but meaning, the truth written with heart, never disappears. It lingers quietly, waiting to be read again. Because in the end, the ink of truth never truly fades.